The calculations that I've read over the last couple of days is that their revenue from the sale of oil is down 50% from a year ago. And that means that they're going to be in trouble, in economic trouble. And that's good. That's good for Ukraine, and that's good for a potential negotiation at some point, because the only way that Russia's ever going to stop this war is when they're forced to. And the only way they're going to be forced to is if they can't afford it. And this is a good step in that direction.
Hello and welcome to Frontline. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're speaking to the financier and political activist Bill Browder. Bill is the head of the global Magnitsky Justice Campaign and has been campaigning against Kremlin oppression and injustice since he was banned from Russia for exposing corruption. Bill, thank you very much for joining us again.
Great to be here.
Well, Bill, Donald Trump has said he's going to cut tariffs on India to around 18% after Delhi pledged to stop buying Russian oil. Let's set aside for now whether or not that will actually happen. How worried will the Kremlin be if India really does cut their oil imports from Russia?
I think that the Kremlin will be absolutely in a panic about that. I mean, if you look at how does Russia wage its war in Ukraine? It wages its war because it has an inflow of money. Where does that money come from? It comes from mostly from the sale of crude oil, from the export of crude oil from Russia. Who buys that crude oil? Three countries. China is the largest buyer, India, the second largest buyer, and Turkey, which is the third largest buyer. If you take one of those buyers out of the equation, India, that puts Russia in a very terrible place. It's not like China and Turkey can pick up the slack. And so you end up with a glut of oil. And if you're, let's say you're the Chinese and you're looking at this situation, you say, you know what, I want a 25% discount on my oil now because we know you're in a weak position. And so if you actually look at the price that Russia is getting per barrel of oil right now, even before this has happened, it's dramatically lower than the international price of Brent crude oil. And so what it means is that Russia gets less money. And the calculations that I've read over the last couple of days is that their revenue from the sale of oil is down 50% from a year ago. And that means that they're going to be in trouble, in economic trouble. And that's good. That's good for Ukraine, and that's good for a potential negotiation at some point, because the only way that Russia's ever going to stop this war is when they're forced to. And the only way they're going to be forced to is if they can't afford it. And this is a good step in that direction.
We have had these sort of pledges beforehand from India and from the US, though, Bill, haven't we? How likely is this to really go ahead and go into effect and not be a kind of shuffling of refineries that we've seen in the past?
Well, it's not just the United States that's a player here. So the European Union is also a player, and one shouldn't underestimate the European Union. The European Union is an economic bloc that's about 80% as big as the United States in terms of its economic power to force countries to obey sanctions and so on. You've got the UK, you've got other countries. And the way I understand it is that in India, these are private businesses. So these are businesses owned by families, these refineries. And they have a lot of other business interests. And the last thing they want to do is be sort of rogue operators where whether it's in relation to the Europeans or the Americans or whomever. And so they're all sort of tiptoeing around this even before this decision was made, which is why the price of oil is down so much for the Russians. And so, I mean, I think it's all very helpful. Now, as far as Donald Trump is concerned, you're right. We don't know what he's going to do. Everything he's done up until now has been sporadic, inconsistent, malign in many cases. And so I think we all we have to do is say that something is happening. The Indians are definitely not feeling emboldened by this move. They're probably wondering themselves what it means, and we just have to see. But what I can say is that the proof is in the numbers, and the numbers are that Russia's oil revenues from a year ago till now are down 50%, and that's a good thing.
And you mentioned some of the other purchases of Russian oil. Who should be next, and how should the US and the EU, if they are feeling more confident, go about bringing that 50% down even further?
It's very simple. There's two oil refineries in China that are the biggest consumers of Russian oil. If they were to stop consuming Russian oil, that would be the end of the story for Vladimir Putin. Um, and it's not as if we have to say to the Chinese, we're going to launch a trade war against your country. We just say that these two refineries are going to not be welcome in the Western world to sell their refined product, to buy, to use banking services, to insure themselves, to dock in our ports or whatever, if they buy Russian oil. And if we were to have the guts to do that, I think that's the end of the story for Vladimir Putin. And for what it's worth, I mean, that's what he's been desperately trying to avoid, because he knows that his lifeline is money. He needs that money to pay for soldiers and weapons and so on. And if that money dries up, he's finished.
And talking about some of these pressures on the Russian oil economy at the moment, there is a sort of wider crackdown we've seen going on. The US seizing several tankers since the start of this year, which seems to have set a precedent, because we've heard about the French also seizing tankers now. Is this going to be? How is this going to be adding to Russia's concerns about being able to get this oil abroad?
Very much so. I mean, I should point out that the U.S. is seizing Russian tankers not as a policy towards Russia. The U.S. hasn't seized any Russian tankers because it's upset with Russia exporting oil. The U.S. has seized Russian tankers because they were involved in exporting oil from the Maduro regime from Venezuela. And so it just so happened that they were Russian tankers, but it's not a policy towards Russia. Having said that, as you mentioned, the French grabbed a Russian tanker, and let's not forget that the Ukrainians are imposing their own sanctions on the shadow fleet. As far as I'm aware, somewhere around 4, maybe 5 tankers have either been blown up or decapacitated or incapacitated, I should say. And so, I mean, it's not a good time to be a skipper of a Russian shadow fleet tanker. You could end up, being a casualty of war. And I think that's how the Ukrainians view it. And so, from all different perspectives, the noose is tightening. And it's kind of a shame that we've had this much time pass before everyone's figured this out, because the noose could have been tightening 2 years ago, and you have a lot less dead Ukrainian civilians. You'd have a lot less, suffering among the Ukrainian population, because the Russians have been bombing them into absolute fear and freezing temperatures and so on. But better late than never.
And talking about that quite often difficult to decode US policy towards Russia on the world stage, we've seen in the last week this idea of a sort of air and energy ceasefire agreed to, and yet Russia appears to have broken that in the last few days, launching massive strikes on Tuesday, about 3 days before that ceasefire was announced to be supposed to end. And yet Donald Trump seems to be suggesting that the ceasefire has been successful. It somehow was supposed to have ended on Sunday. What's going on there? Is Trump trying to save face, do you think? Or is this just a worrying level of inconsistency in how the US is dealing with Russia?
Well, Trump is sort of in the business of telling us things that are contrary to our own what our own eyes can see. He was the one who said to Vladimir Zelensky, "You shouldn't have started this war." He's the one who's telling us all sorts of things which are so obvious that and so he's saying that somehow a ceasefire that he was promised has held when it hasn't. And I think that this is particularly worrisome when it comes to this supposed security guarantees that America is promising Ukraine if they were to give up all sorts of territory. First of all, I don't think Ukraine should give up all sorts of territory, because that's insane and absurd. But secondly, if Donald Trump is saying how proud he is of a ceasefire, which Putin promised him, which Putin didn't adhere to, then how can we trust that America, with any security guarantee, would act on that security guarantee. And I think we have to come to the stark conclusion that those guarantees, those promises, are empty promises.
Yeah, and we talk about those negotiations. The Ukrainian and Russian delegations met again in Abu Dhabi yesterday. There's not been any sign of real progress yet. We haven't heard of what the results have actually been or any specifics. But the Ukrainians and the Russians and the Americans are all saying that there is progress in the talks. These were originally boasted as a kind of trilateral talk that we've seen promised for so long. It doesn't really feel like these are those full trilaterals, because a lot of people thought those would be between the kind of leaders of the nations. Should we be watching these talks closely, or is it again a kind of dilution of what we really expected?
Well, I believe that the only purpose of these talks from the Russian side is to indicate that they're involved in some kind of talks. It's just a way to kick the can down the road. I think the purpose of the talks from the Ukrainian side is to say, look, we're ready to agree to most things. Stop the war. Please force Russia to stop their illegal invasion. And I think the purpose from the American side is because Donald Trump promised that the war would be over in 24 hours and he can't be giving up and doing nothing. As far as I'm concerned, Putin has no intention of stopping the war. He can't stop the war, and he won't stop the war. And so I think that, if you wanted to simplify your life, you could safely ignore all this talk about progress and talks and just get back to the fundamentals, which is that we need to stop Russia from doing this. How do we force them to not do this? We take away their economic ability to do this, and at the same time, the fundamentals are that we need to give Ukraine the tools they need to incapacitate Russia wherever they can, and most importantly, we need to give Ukraine the tools to defend their own skies, so that the entire population of Ukraine isn't suffering like they are right now, because the Russian bombs are just coming down on them without any interference, because Ukraine has run out of defensive weapons.
And we've seen that some Scandinavian countries have pledged more money to help buy air defense missiles for Ukraine. Is that coming a little too late, though? Because there is going to be a pretty significant gap at this point, presumably, between when money is pledged and when things are going to start to arrive.
Well, I think everything is always too little, too late when it comes to helping Ukraine. We're now in early February. There's probably another 4 to 6 weeks of really bad cold weather, and then things start to warm up. And it's the real pernicious part of what Russia is doing right now is that they're destroying the heating and the electricity plants in Ukraine, and so people are sitting in these Soviet era apartment blocks, literally freezing in the most horrible way. And I mean, with no respite until the weather warms up. And this is one way to terrorize the entire population. So every single person in Ukraine feels it in their bones, how cold and horrible it is, and they have no way of warming themselves up. And that's what Russia is doing now. Once the weather warms up, then Ukraine is an enormous country. There's just no way they can carpet bomb the whole country, and so they kind of lose that sort of psychological advantage until the next winter comes along. Now, of course, if Ukraine were to have defensive weapons, air defense, they could stop some of this pain. But I don't know. I don't know, and I don't think any of that's going to come in time for this winter. But the one thing I can say for sure is that no matter how cold the Ukrainians are and how physically painful this is, it's a lot less physically painful than to be under Russian occupation, where all the women get raped, all the men get tortured, and all the children get kidnapped. And that's why the Ukrainians will continue to fight on, no matter how cold it is and how unpleasant it is.
And we have seen, I mean, the Ukrainians are very familiar with this strategy of the Russians to wait until winter, stockpile weapons, and then bombard major cities to try and diminish morale and cause real damage when the temperatures get this low. After the very harsh conditions of this winter and the political changes we've seen as well in the last 6 months, do you think Ukraine by this time next year will be in a better position to weather through this sort of attack if the war is still ongoing?
Well, what happens between this year and next year is that Ukraine has one huge advantage, which is they're really good at hitting economic targets in Russia, and they will continue to hit those economic targets in Russia. And so they've disabled a whole swath of oil refining capacity in Russia. So they take some of their crude oil and refine it into gasoline, and Ukrainians have hit all sorts of oil refineries in Russia, and they will continue to do that. They'll continue to hit the shadow fleet. They'll continue to hit military targets inside of Russia, and then hopefully we see the new European sanctions, which are going to continue to disable Russia's ability to export crude oil, and hopefully this is the type of thing which then puts Putin in a very bad place. And Putin doesn't. I mean, he is running out of soldiers. The Ukrainians are killing more soldiers on a monthly basis than Russia is able to recruit. Russia is trying to recruit soldiers from abroad. We've seen these horrific stories of Africans recruited and then basically put landmines on their body so they can run into Ukrainian territory as suicide bombers. We've seen these stories, of course, about the North Koreans and other nationalities coming into the country. Russia's running out of soldiers. They're trying to get, and then they run out of money. They can't even pay the foreign soldiers that are duped into coming into the country. And so this is not a good situation for Vladimir Putin. He can put on a brave face. He can sacrifice soldiers, but at the same time, what he hasn't been able to do is he hasn't imposed a general conscription on the population. And the reason he hasn't done that is he understands that if he does that, that might be the red line for the Russian people when they start to really get angry with him. And so, he's got huge pressures on himself. He has one big capacity, which is the pain and suffering of his own people. But even that, there is a limit, and we don't know where that limit is. All we can do and hope for is that by imposing economic pain on Putin and limiting his money, that comes sooner rather than later.
And Russia says they aren't, they've put that brave face on, as you say. But even Putin this week has admitted that the Russian economy grew by just 1% in 2025. Further to that, Vladimir Putin is not necessarily a reliable source for the West, at least on Russia's success or failure. Where do you think the Russian economy could be at this point?
Well, if they're telling you it's plus 1%, then I would say it's probably minus 5%. Just because they're making up the numbers. They're the ones who gather the statistics that they then present to the rest of the world. There's the Russian economy is a very sort of narrow economy. It's a resource economy, and I guess now it's resource plus military manufacturing economy. But there's really huge problems that they have very high inflation. They have no. They've lost 1 million young men to 1.2 million young men to war casualties, either death or disability, and they've lost another million men who didn't want to be in that first group who have fled the country. And so there's skills gaps all over the place in the economy. There's some huge banking crisis that's sort of bumbling under the surface because loans made by the Russian banking sector aren't being repaid. You have tax revenues which have collapsed. You have like Gazprom, for example, used to be 25% of the tax revenues of Russia. Gazprom is now a money-losing company. They're not making any money. You have the same thing happening at Rosneft, Lukoil, etc. It's not a good picture, and whatever they're telling you, it's much worse than what they're saying. And so I think the Russian economy is in a really pretty desperate place. But again, this is not a democracy. Putin doesn't have to run for any re-elections. He doesn't have the people be happy with him. He has to have the people be scared of him. And as long as he can have that, he can carry on in some way. I mean, look at North Korea. North Korea is an economic disaster, but they have managed for generations of Kims to repress their people. So hard to know how Russia ultimately deals with all this adversity, but the adversity is there.
And FIFA's chief Gianni Infantino has said that the ban on Russia's participation in global football competitions should be lifted. He says it's achieved nothing, is the quote that's been attributed to him. Is that really a fair judgment of the bans that have been placed on Russian sportsmen and women?
Well, the bans should be on all Russians in all sports for all reasons. That you can't have a genocidal, murderous country being celebrated in international sports competitions. And this Infantino character is a disgraced man from all sorts of different stories, and I wouldn't listen to what he says. And I sure hope that that Russian sportsmen are not allowed to compete in international football.
When we hear things like that, how much do you worry, Bill, that Russia might be able to sort of thread the needle here? They certainly believe that eventually they can get the West to give up on sanctions and trying to cut Russia out of the global economy. Yet at the same time, as you say, this idea that Putin seems to project onto the world stage, that this war can just go on for Russia as long as they like, probably doesn't hold that much water when we look into the state of the Russian economy. Do you think Putin can keep relying on that strategy of trying to convince everyone that Russia can just fight a forever war?
Well, I mean, Russia can fight a forever war until they collapse. I mean, they can and they will. And it's just a question of whether when they collapse. And the question is, do they collapse before we collapse? And when I say we collapse, we're not going to economically collapse, but we might ethically or morally collapse at some point. And look, I mean, I remember when the war started. The United States said, you know, we are side by side with our allies supporting Ukraine until this is over. And then there was a change in government, and Donald Trump stopped supporting Ukraine economically and stopped supporting Ukraine with military support. And so, could that happen elsewhere? Well, there's all sorts of elections in Europe that are taking place, and some of those elections may elect people who are pro-Russian. We know that the National Front in France received money from Russia. We know the AfD is repeating Russian talking points in Germany. Will those two right-wing parties be able to prevail in elections? And if they do, would they then break the European support for Ukraine? Hard to say. I remember everyone was worried about Giorgia Meloni being a right-wing candidate, and she's been perfect as far as Ukraine is concerned. And then, of course, we don't know how all the alignment between these right-wing parties and Donald Trump will help or harm their electoral chances in the elections that they have going forward. It's not Donald Trump may be popular among certain people in America, but he certainly isn't in Europe, and we've seen splits in those right-wing candidates in their relationship with Donald Trump because they understand that it's an electoral disaster in Europe. So it's hard to say, but what Putin is banking on is that there's so many different things in the air, so many things that could go wrong for us, that if he just carries on, he might be able to weather through it. And he might be right. Hard to say. I hope not.
Well, Sir Bill Browder, head of the Global Magnitsky Justice Campaign, thank you very much for joining me today on Frontline.
Thank you.